Do you ever wonder if you're really getting the full story? Like, do the people who are telling you the truth, do they have your best interests at heart? Hi, my name is Greg Simpson. I'm a minister in the United Church of Canada. And whether you've been studying this book for a long time or maybe just new to open its pages and read a story or two, I bet that there are some parts of this that either you didn't know about, or maybe they're even being purposely hidden from you. One theme throughout my preaching right now and through some of my YouTube videos is the act of resurfacing some of the stories about women in the Bible and in early Christianity to unpack the difference between the patriarchy from which these stories came and the misogyny that still exists today. So if you've never heard the story of Unia the Apostle, you definitely need to watch this one. I'm going to send you over to a sermon that I preached just a couple of weeks ago. Now, typically what we do is we would go and we would read some scripture and then we would step into our sermon, but there's a bunch of different scriptures that I want to reference today. Some of you are nervous seeing that I've got 5 Bibles sitting here. We're about to see from 8 others in just a minute, but this idea of this conversation around feminism and Christianity and the idea of biblical womanhood, this is a rabbit hole. And it's exciting and it's fun. And I have spent a couple of weeks deeply immersed in a whole lot of stuff that I wish I knew earlier. Some of it is stuff that's in here that, although I've been through this many, many times, I just didn't notice because I wasn't looking at it the right way. But I want to start with a couple of stories. And so if we can get the first slide up, this woman is Mary Mills, the Reverend Mary Mills. She was, in 1969, the first deaconess ordained in the Anglican Church of Canada, 1969. In 1976, she and 5 other women were the first priests ordained in the Anglican Church, first female priests ordained in the Anglican Church of Canada. But there's a more important picture of this lady. If you can get the next slide. Just see that gangly looking kid next to her? So Mary Mills is a very dear friend of my grandmother's growing up. It wasn't until much later. I mean, I knew that she was a minister, but it didn't cross my mind at all that it was weird for a woman to be a minister. I know, right? So I actually texted my mom. I'm like, can you get me a picture that has Mary and me in the same picture? She sent me a couple from Christmas and a couple. This is actually a picture of my mom's piano recital from who knows what year. Anyhow, that's enough of the embarrassment there. But it never crossed my mind that it was odd that Mary was a priest. Now, that might just be because she was just Mary, as far as I knew, and then I also knew that she helped out at the church. I mean, she was pretty much retired by this time, helping out at St. John's Anglican in Glencoe. But then as you do a little bit digging, then I was curious about the United Church of Canada. And so if we can get this next picture up here, this woman is Lydia Grucci, and she was the first ordained woman in the United Church of Canada. Now, she was ordained in 1936, so we're going back a bunch of years. So Mary was 1976. Lydia was 1936. She had been attempting to become a minister within the Presbyterian Church of Canada in the mid-20s. And then when the Presbyterians, Methodists, Congregationalists joined together to create the United Church of Canada, it was out in the West, it was Saskatchewan where she was ordained. And actually the Conference of Saskatchewan said, we're not even going to bother asking the National Church what you think. We're just going to go ahead and ordain her. Which is, I think, is actually a really lovely thing. How many times do we talk about asking forgiveness afterwards instead of permission ahead of time? That is exactly what happened. So this feels like a good news story. Mary in 1976, Lydia in 1936. But some of these stories are 2,000 years old. What happened to the 2,000 years between Jesus, who spent his time strolling around, chatting with women? The bulk of his ministry was financed by women. You do have to look carefully to find them because, of course, it was men writing this, and it's men who have shared this, and it's patriarchal societies between then and now. But the women
who hung around with Jesus had an awful lot of power. And so some of you might be thinking, yeah, but Greg, we also see in other places, like Paul writes frequently about what women are to do and are not to do in the service of the church. Well, we're going to get back to Paul in just a moment. But I wonder if you guys remember a certain person named Mary Magdalene. Does that name ring a bell at all? Do you remember what was one of the critical things about Mary Magdalene? Now, there could be a long list of things, so maybe this is an unfair test. But Mary Magdalene, in each of the Gospels, was the first person to see the risen Christ, and the first person to share that message with the rest of the apostles. So what about the 2,000 years between then and now? It was only in 1936 and 1976 that Canada, a comparatively progressive, religiously nation, decided to start ordaining women. That's the rabbit hole that I've spent a couple of weeks digging through. We're going to have to go back, way back. And the first question I have, or the first on the list of, I wish they'd told me this when I was younger. Maybe when I was the size of that little picture up there. I didn't dress well then either, did I? No, I agree. Do you guys remember Genesis? Right at the very, very beginning of this book. This is the part that Aaron already stole my thunder a little bit. We get in the book of Genesis, Chapter 1, we get the story of the creation of the earth. Now, unfortunately, there are no actual dinosaurs listed here. And like Aaron said, we need to play with this a little bit to resolve the story we read here with the story in our head, or the story that science tells us. We have to do some work there to find truth in both. But here's the tricky question that I learned not too long ago, but I should have learned when I was this big. How many creation stories are in the Bible? Anybody? Anybody? Feels like there's one, right? There are two. And they're right next to each other, and they don't even agree. So I'm not going to read all of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but Genesis 1 from the beginning to 2:4 is the first story, and that's the one that talks about 7 days, right? We're familiar with that. We're going to get back to why this is critically important in our conversation about women's place in the church in just a second, because in the 7-day version of the creation, men and women are created at the same time. There's no distinction, there's no nothing, it's just God creates humans. And in God's image, they are created. And then we get the second story that starts at Genesis 2:4b, if you're really snotty about where exactly it lands, and it continues on into it. Well, the creation story runs to the end of chapter 2, and this is the one where we hear about the animals being created, and then God seeing that Adam needed a helper or a guide or somebody to be with him, and then they kind of go through all the animals and find that none of them are suitable, and so then Adam falls asleep, he takes a rib. Remember, this is familiar, right? But did you know that those are two totally separate stories? Why isn't that on the flannel graph in Sunday school? That would have been interesting. Some of you had flannel graphs, I know. That would have been critically interesting to me because it starts to unwind an idea that says, but the woman was created second, and thus she's subservient. Now, it gets even better than that, because the word for helper, so it says God saw that Adam needed a helper, and the word for helper gets translated to helper into English. It shows up a few other places in the Bible, and almost, especially in the Old Testament, almost every other place where it shows up, it is a godly character. So whether it's an angel, a messenger, God himself as a helper, a guide. And so when we see, even in the second creation story, Eve being created, she doesn't even get the name Eve until the end of chapter 3. So the woman being created, she is created in a fashion that says, without her, Adam couldn't survive. But if we read it as helper, that sounds totally different, doesn't it? And what that starts to tell us is that the words that we read here, because I don't know if any of you read ancient Hebrew, there's a very, very small number of people who do, and an even smaller number of people who actually understand it. But if we are reading this, we need to recognize that all of the years of translation and transmission of these words have a deep impact. If we, every time we read this, said, and Eve was created because Adam couldn't have survived without her, wouldn't that create a slightly different understanding of relationship between men and women? Which brings us to Paul. This is why we didn't actually read any scripture, because I'd be reading the entire Bible just before we got to the message. It brings us to Paul. I wonder, actually, this is an interesting test, and I'm not expecting everybody to get this, but does anybody know of a verse that people would use within Christian communities to tell women not to be ministers? Does anybody know of it? Like, have you heard some phrases like that? There's one particularly in 1 Corinthians 14 that talks about how, and Paul is writing, I would not let a woman speak in church. That's the way that one is worded. And then in 1 Timothy 2, we get a couple other cases where Paul is speaking to the early church and describing what women should not do. And that includes leading women speaking in church, leading men speaking in church, even actually asking questions. The idea there is that if she has questions, she can go home and ask her husband when she gets home. We're going to spend not much time unpacking that because that is a deep and complicated thing. But the things that you do absolutely need to know is that for more than 100 years, most scholars agree Paul did not write 2 Timothy. It was actually probably written about 50 years after he was dead. So unless there's some other miracle going on there, he didn't write that. And even as we look at the words of 1 and 2 Timothy, they even sound different and they disagree with some of the stuff that he wrote earlier in Corinthians. But he did write Romans. And Romans is this beautiful story, this beautiful sort of master's thesis of Paul's opinion of what Christianity is. And it has deep theology. And if you don't actually have a master's of theology, a lot of Romans is difficult to get through. So we're going to ignore most of it. And what we're going to do is skip to the very ending bit, Romans 16. And this is also one of the verses that most ministers and every layperson tries to avoid reading, because this is one of the ones that's just chock full of names, and they're all Greek names that our lips aren't really used to saying. So I'm going to read a little bit of this, but I'm going to start to you with the very first verse of this little context. This is the end of the letter. He's written this huge letter that's his treatise on what Christianity is. And the end of it, it's called a doxology. He's writing very personally to the people. And he's greeting people. And we've seen him do this in other places. This is the longest case where he just goes off and he names all sorts of people that he has been in ministry with. And I think this is critical because this isn't Paul trying to describe what Christianity is or isn't or should be. He's literally just tipping his hat and saying, thank you to all the people who have been involved in his ministry. We're going to hear that some of them were in jail with him. Some of them were the people who carried his letters to other places. And right off the top, Genesis 16:1, he starts by saying, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church. Hang on a second. Wasn't Mary Mills the first deacon in the Anglican Church in Canada? But Phoebe, a deacon, 2,000 years before. And this isn't Paul saying, oh, she shouldn't have been. It's him saying, thank you for being a deacon. In Paul's time, women were critically important in the church. And there's other stuff that has happened since then. He goes on, so that many of you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting of the saints and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and myself as well. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, Priscilla's another woman. Sometimes these are tricky because we don't really know gender. Like you got to look at the Greek to know them. I definitely had to look this up. I don't speak Greek either. Priscilla and Aquila, who work with me in Jesus Christ and who risked their necks for my life, to whom I not only give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Greet also the church in their house. Greet my beloved Epaenetus, who was the first convert in Asia for Christ. Greet Mary, we know that Mary is a female name, who has worked very hard among you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, they were in Christ before I was. Andronicus and Junia. We're going to pause there for a minute. Andronicus is definitely a male name. Junia is definitely a female name. Except, this is part of the reason I've got a stack of Bibles here. And I wonder, is there a slide with a bunch of little boxes? Is that the one next up? Oh, okay. So I actually took a picture of this. So that's not big enough. Can you read that? So I just read Andronicus and Junia, and this is Andronicus and Junius. And as we look through history, the translation of this person's name shifts from being female to male. Now, this is where the rabbit hole gets very, very deep and gets well outside of my regular skill set. So I had to look to a lot of other very much smarter people than me. And as they analyze a lot of other Greek writing, this name sounds male. It follows the proper pathways of what it would be, but it's not a name. There's only one place, one in all of any Greek writing that we have today, one ever, that has this name as an actual name. It's like somehow we were taking a name and we just made it made it male, although it was never meant to be. Like say you knew a person named Ruth and you wanted to minimize the fact that Ruth was female, and so you just started calling him Ruthit and said, no, that's a male name. But nobody is called Ruthit, and nobody is called Junius. And so the wise scholars do the work of saying, well, if we don't really understand 2,000 years later what was going on, let's look to people who knew just soon after this was written down. And so they look to the ancient church leaders. John of Chrysostom is one of them. Origen is another one. And so we're talking about like 400 AD and 260 AD. All of them say Junia. All of them say she was a woman. And also importantly, all of them say she was an apostle. See, the words that come right after this are, who were in prison with me, they were prominent among the apostles. Not only was she a woman, and not only was Paul recognizing her, but he is stacking her up to be at the same level as the apostles. So folks, names we know, like Matthew and Mark and Peter and John, the sons of Zebedee, and Junia. Women have been a critical piece of Christianity for as long as anybody has talked about Christianity, and yet, in the work of the church, as the church went from being something that was an offshoot of Judaism, and then in the 300s to 400s became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then that grew into the Roman Catholic Church, and there's the history of how this went on. The beautiful thing is that the early Roman Catholic Church had roles for women. Have you ever heard of nuns? And I'm not saying that is the best and most supportive thing. They had to turn their backs on being mothers and being wives. They had to cloister themselves and be only that. But if we look to our Catholic heritage, there are so many women saints named and venerated. And the work that they did is the sort of work that addresses the words from Genesis, that if it weren't for them, Adam wouldn't have been able to get by. If it weren't for all of the women who did the work in the ancient church, it wouldn't be here. Now, I know this has absolutely nothing to do with a song from the 1960s, and I promise you that is where I started. But what I realized is if we look at the time and the way that that feminism and Christianity have mapped over each other from the 60s to now, it's getting worse. How can that be? Now, it's not getting worse everywhere. I think that the United Church, if we're going to stack some up, when I went to school, I was 2 males in a group of 25 people. So there are definitely a lot of women engaged in the ministry of the United Church of Canada. And we are not alone. There are more female than male ministers in the Anglican Church as well. Priests, anyhow, fewer female bishops. It's still difficult for female to take the next up sort of roles. And we know that the Catholic Church has a lot of really stringent rules around who can and cannot be a minister. But those are ancient rules, and I'm not even going to address those. What I do want to talk about is some of the modern evangelical churches. Because if we look at the political landscape, women can vote. Women are absolutely allowed to take positions of power. We know that there are some disparities around what people are paid for the jobs they do. That is a reality, but those things are at least they're not getting worse. They might be stagnant or maybe heading a little bit in the right direction. But in some spaces in Christianity, it's getting worse. And when you look at the map of 1960s and women who were singing in churches, songs like what you guys just sang, it might have been a secular song, but those are the sorts of things that were taking women and building them up and saying, I should be respected and recognized for being exactly who I am. And then there's a segment of the church that got nervous enough about that they've doubled down on saying, no, women should be quiet, women should be subservient. And they use lines like Junius, and they're rewriting to make them not even apostles, to say, see, it's always been this way because it's in the Bible. Because the Bible feels old. Right? The stories here are old. We get to the next slide, please. Here's where it gets quite interesting. Now, I realize this is really, really small, and it took me a lot of research, and I was going to actually, all of these ones are different than those ones. Every single Bible says something different, which is an important thing for us to recognize. But at the top left there, you see 1611, good old King James. Junia, an apostle. And as we go through, it's not just age-related, because there are a couple where it sees it floating in, but in 2011, 2012, 2018, in these Bibles that are being retranslated, work that's being done by scholars in the evangelical and conservative churches in the States, they are getting further and further into the writing that eliminates women from the Bible. They are intentionally taking words that for thousands of years we've recognized as building women up and recognizing their places in the church, and they're erasing them. Changing names, changing jobs. Where I read deaconess, here it's very, very clearly a deacon of the church. In the, I'm trying to remember which one that is. It's one of those. That's okay. The English Standard Version, it just names her as a helper. It so completely changes the word to say this is a person who is subservient in the church, even then. This is intentional and active work that churches are doing to resist the political work that is happening. The reason I want to focus on that is because we too are a church. We are all here because we believe a lot of the stuff that's in there. But although I've read Romans a lot of times, I was never aware that it's used as a weapon against women. I think one of the most important things that we can do as a church is start by knowing. Start by knowing that when somebody says, oh yes, but this is a model of biblical womanhood, and this is what it says in the Bible, and thus it's true, we need to know where they're coming from. What's their intent? What are their rhetorical goals? Because we bump into, whether it be in our neighborhoods or in our wide experience on the internet, we bump into people who would say they are Christian. And so then we're like, oh yeah, they're just like us. But then they use these tools to oppress. And it's getting worse. I think it's now time for churches who would build up, who would fight oppression, who would stand up for voices that are being erased, who would spend time knowing and learning and getting to the root of some of these difficulties. It's time for us to stop being idle. For we also have loud voices. We also have a big platform. The United Church of Canada is the largest denomination in Canada. Largest Protestant denomination in Canada. We are absolutely dwarfed by the Southern Baptists and the Evangelical Church in the States, just by numbers alone, but we have a voice. And it's up to us to stand up to those who would use the same tools that we find very supportive and loving, say that's not what it says, and it's not what has always said. Now, I have a laundry list of particular men who are leaders in church. I'll give that to you some other time. It's not worth going through because these are also people who find themselves in complicated lawsuits around lots of other stuff where leadership of churches becomes a power struggle, and it has more to do with tax evasion and those sorts of, you know who I'm talking about. These are the sorts of people who literally in the 90s, when the New International Version of the Bible was being created, which is still a relatively conservative version, they looked at it and said, oh, wait a minute, you're doing away with the word mankind and making it humankind, which is far too inclusive. We'd best write our own Bible then. It's that intentional, people, so that they could hold up a Bible and say, it's always been this way. We are meant to oppress other people. But do you remember this character who shows up an awful lot in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? This guy that Paul says he met on a road on the way to Damascus. This man named Jesus, who we would say we follow. We are Christians, little Christ. We are the people who follow Jesus. Do you remember what the most important commandment was as far as he was concerned? Love the Lord your God with your whole heart, mind, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself. There are a lot of different messages inside of these books. There are a lot of different ways that you can use them. But any one of those ways that has to ignore Jesus' commandment to love everyone as ourselves, that message needs to be analyzed. There's a lot of hurt out there, and church has done a lot of it. We need to be the ones to step up and say, we are sorry for the way that the church has treated you. We're going to do better. This didn't just start in 1960 with some fantastic songs from Aretha Franklin. This started 2,000 years ago with Phoebe and Junia and Priscilla and Mary Magdalene. The women who stood by Jesus, the women who led the early church, the helpers of Adam, without whom we couldn't survive. Amen.
Thank you for joining me this morning, and thank you so much for listening as we unpack some of the stories around women. This is going to continue, so I'll put a link up there of another famous woman in the Bible who you may or may not have heard of. And if you'd like to hear more about this, you can click up there and subscribe. I love you all. We'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.